We're 8 days away from live game action. Which non-conference game will tell us a lot about where this team is headed this season? You're locked on.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. It's part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, I'd like to take a quick moment to ask for a small favor. If you're enjoying the content, please take a second to subscribe. Follow wherever you listen to your audio versions, Apple, Spotify, you name it. It all helps the show grow, and I genuinely appreciate the support. Every follow, subscription, and download not only helps build our UConn community, but also generates more revenue for UConn NIL initiatives. So that is a huge deal. When you support Locked On UConn, you're directly supporting our UConn NIL initiatives through Bleeding Blue for Good. And here's something also I'm excited about. I'm donating 10% of all revenue to the Husky Ticket Project. It's a proud partner of mine. We're here to help kids, send them to games, and make a real difference in the community. Thank you for being a part of this journey with me and for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay. We're counting down the days to the start of the college basketball season, just 7 days away. And UConn fans, we're just 8 days away from tipping off the season with a home opener against Sacred Heart. Today, we're breaking down some of the most intriguing matchups of UConn's 24-25 schedule. I've included, I think, 5 or 6 that are intriguing to me. Most are non-conference. One, I think you'll understand why when I talk about it, but also showdowns in the Maui Invitational and several other powerhouse matchups. Let's get into it, shall we? First part of this schedule that I'm really interested in, and I've talked about this already, is the Maui Invitational. It stands out as much as a must-watch early in the season as any tournament that there is. First off, it's just really cool, like to have the kids go out to Hawaii and have this kind of opportunity to be out in the sun, and also kind of have an interesting mental exercise of you have to lock yourself in for a tournament style. There's no days off. You play 3 games. Win or lose, you get 3 games. And there's some really strong competition. We open against Memphis, a familiar AAC rival, with a strong, unpredictable squad, with an equally as strong and unpredictable coach in Penny Hardaway. The Maui bracket is loaded. If UConn advances, we'll likely see clashes with Michigan State, Colorado, or even top-ranked teams like Iowa State and North Carolina, or Auburn in the final. These games will offer early indicators of how UConn measures up against national contenders and test their depth right from the start, albeit in a neutral site. Moving into December, another huge matchup awaits. The home games against Baylor at Gamble Pavilion. Be really cool. We're going to see it already, but against a big-time opponent with the new boards, how that's going to look on TV, and for those that are going to be there in person. Baylor brings a really stacked roster, including transfers and talented newcomers like freshman VJ Edgecombe. Baylor has familiar folks like Norchad Ormir, who we faced in the Final Four, and also the transfer from Duke, who's playing point guard this year, Jeremy Roach, who surprisingly told, I think, Matt Norlander that he wanted to go back to Duke, but they told him that there was no room for him. So you got to think a guy like that is coming back with a chip on his shoulder, so that'll be an interesting showdown. Baylor always plays tough. Scott Drew's teams are always well coached, so that's going to be an interesting one. They're a top 10 team. UConn fans will pack Gamble, and that showdown could be one of the most electric atmospheres of the season, early or otherwise. So I expect this game to test both teams on offense and defense, especially as Baylor's depth and UConn's versatile lineup clash. I think the interesting aspect of this is we talked about this early on in the year and early on this year about how with the loss of Donovan Clingan, I started to look at some of our opponents. And one of the things that I noticed is there wasn't a dominating inside presence for really any of the teams that we play. There's no 7'1" guy. There's no Zach Edey. most of the rosters we're playing are constructed similar to ours, where there's fours and fives who are typically that 6'8" to 6'10", maybe 6'11" range. So we're not playing a team that has an incredible inside presence. Although I'm talking about just from a height perspective. Although I think Baylor is going to have some really interesting players to watch here, and I'm curious at that point what our interior defense is going to look like from a rotational perspective. So again, that one's going to be an interesting one. Then finally, the game I teased as one in my cold open as the one we'll know about our team when it's over. And I've already faced the likes of a North Carolina, an Iowa State, a Michigan State, a Colorado, Auburn, Dayton, or Memphis, in Maui. Those are all the teams that are potentials. We're definitely playing Memphis. But after Baylor is a road trip to Austin, Texas, to face the University of Texas. This rematch follows last year's close game at Madison Square Garden, where UConn pulled off a 10-point victory. Texas has only gotten stronger with transfer additions and talented homegrown stars. Liam McNeely, one of UConn's top freshmen, will be making a bit of a homecoming here, adding another layer to this intriguing matchup. I joked around that when they were recruiting Liam, they probably threw in, hey, we're playing a couple Texas teams next year in case your family wants to come watch you play. So who knows if that was part of the case. But the reason why I mentioned this, and let me take a quick drink of water, about this is the game where we're really going to know about this team by then, is because if we look at this team's schedule and we go and look at who they'll have played, and I just mentioned they're going to play a ton of teams that are going to be top ranked. But again, I know about this stuff because I literally did a entire project around how scheduling matters in college basketball, from the tops to the bottoms and the challenges of both, right? And when you have a true road game, albeit a lot of high majors don't play a lot of true road games, not going to play Gonzaga at Madison Square Garden, which is the next game, not going out to Maui and playing three really good teams, not the Coaches versus Cancer Classic at the Garden or United Center and places like that, or out in Vegas. We did that Portland tournament 2 years ago. But I'm talking about going into someone's house on their campus and facing all of their fans, not a mixture of your fans and their fans, where a lot of times the better teams typically overrun the team that's not regionally there. So, like, for example, when UConn plays Gonzaga in Madison Square Garden, it's going to be a huge advantage for UConn. Huge, which is great. But at Texas, not so much. Because, again, you're going into their house, you're playing in front of their fans, they're going to go crazy. When Baylor comes to Gamble, our fans are going to kind of go crazy in front of them. And that's going to be a really difficult test for that Baylor and Scott Drew's team. So that's my biggest testament on December 8th. At the end of that game, it's a 5 p.m. start. The next day on December 9th, we're going to know what this team is made of. If we get our doors blown off, which I don't think is going to happen, then we know we have a long way to go. If it's a tough, hard-fought game like we played last year against Kansas and we lose by a few possessions, 1 possession, 2 possessions, you're going to know this team is tough. And winning on the road in tough environments in the SEC, Big 12, ACC, places like that in the Big East is not an easy thing. So if we lose that game, I will not be concerned. But how we lose or how we play is going to be what we look at. So again, that's speculation, but that's the one I'm looking for. Then again, as we tease the Gonzaga matchup at Madison Square Garden, I think Gonzaga is much improved. But UConn fans know the numbers. We've had their number in recent years, including dominant wins in the Elite Eight in 2023. But this Zags team might be a little different. So a little more talented. Key players like Graham Ike and Ryan Nembhard are there. The Madison Square Garden stage and these two powerhouse programs make this a game that will be circled as in front of many fans in calendars this year. I know my friend at Locked On Zags, Andy Patton, will probably be excited for that one. Maybe we'll do a crossover. And finally, this one's interesting because Dan and I talked about this last week. January 8th brings a Big East rivalry game against Villanova at Finneran Pavilion. It's a venue shift. It's also a revenue shift because they're not going to make that much money. But the interesting thing is we just talked about true road games. This is the epitome of a true road game. You're going to go and play in this smaller campus setting that could give Nova an edge. And Villanova has struggled under Coach Kyle Neptune recently, but They're eager to defend their turf on campus. This game will set the tone for UConn's conference play with Villanova. It has a totally revamped squad featuring center Eric Dixon, posing a tough interior matchup for the now Klingon-less Huskies. So, again, those are the ones I'm looking forward to. That Villanova game is really interesting. Kind of reminds me of the St. John's with trying to get people out in the Carnesecca Arena on campus and getting people away from MSG so that UConn doesn't have that advantage. But, yeah, that's a tough one. You're giving up kind of a big gate there at the Wells Fargo to kind of get an edge and see if you can win a game. But I like it. It's good for college basketball. There's too much money involved in college basketball. We're constantly talking about what makes sense from a monetary perspective. If this gives you an edge, do it. Good on you, Villanova. So coming up, before we get into the juicy matchups, there are some pesky bye games to get to. Some with some interesting opportunities to figure out who this team is and who's going to get those precious minutes before Maui. And also, what's a bye game? Coming up after this. What's up, NFL fans? There's a game tonight. Monday Night Football. My lowly Giants against those Pittsburgh Steelers and Russell Wilson. And if you're not a FanDuel customer right now, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, like, I don't know, maybe you think Russell Wilson's going to throw a touchdown to George Pickens, you can check out those latest stats, the odds there, review live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. That's a really good option in this day and age, just to do live bets, because you kind of get a feel for what's going on in the game. So if you do that, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com to get started. Go Giants. And you're back on Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto. Talking about matchups today. We're essentially a week away. It's October 28th. Our first UConn men's basketball game is November 6th against the Sacred Heart Pioneers. My old alma mater. I pray for them. I hope everything goes well in that game for them, but not too well. But let's talk about what this means. I wanted to go through these bye games because rarely do people talk about them and their significance, what they are. So let's talk about this. A bye game, also known as a guarantee game or a paycheck game, is a college basketball game where a larger school, UConn, pays a much smaller school to play. These games are important for power conference schools to add to their season ticket packages. Also, it ensures they can count on some wins during the year. It's also a way to round out your schedule. A lot of it is done with networking. So if you have a relationship with certain coaches, like, for example, down south where I now live, before Roy Williams retired, one of his assistants, and I think one of the people involved with building a new facility on Elon's campus here in North Carolina knew Roy really well, and Roy decided to go play a bye game, but at Elon to open an arena. So a lot of times people know the coaches, maybe assistant coaches worked under a coach, and now they're kind of paying them back by saying, hey, you pay us to play you, and it rounds out your schedule. It's a win-win. It's also typically where you try to find teams that can't beat you, because bye games help smaller schools fill their schedule and puts money in their pocket. What's that great meme for some of the football bye weeks from North Carolina A&T beating, I believe, East Carolina, where it's like, bring me my money. Now someone get me my money, like, right? That check or whatever. So that's the other part of this is when you schedule a bye game, you kind of have to be careful that you don't schedule a mid-major or a low major that's a little too good early in the year. That could come up and bite you in the butt because they kind of sneak up on you. But I don't think UConn's really going to have to worry about that. Those are more for, late 20s, 30s, 40s ranked teams that kind of are trying to make the tournament, that can get clipped by an older mid-major team that's looking to kind of make a name for itself. I've been to a few of those games down here, and it happens. But anyway, that's a bye game. And they typically are scheduled well in advance, and then they fill out some ones down the stretch. And one of my funniest things about college basketball, covering it, John Rothstein, the college basketball CBS insider and college basketball analyst, he calls the rules of brutality established in 2016 clearly state that when a team loses a bye game, it will then be labeled as the epitome of brutality. Because you have to admit, if UConn pays Sacred Heart however amount of money, $600,000, whatever, I don't even know what the number is, however much, it's a considerable amount of money, $500,000 to come and play at Gamble or at XL Center, and they lose, it's pretty much the epitome of brutality. You're paying someone to come beat you. So that's where that comes from. But we're previewing the games this year, the bye games, a little bit in reverse. So let's start with Maryland Eastern Shore, a familiar HBCU matchup. Maryland Eastern Shore will be the final game on UConn's bye schedule this year, led by Coach Cleo Hill Jr. Historically an underdog program. They are ranked, according to Ken Pom, 362nd. Top 200 only once since 1997. UConn has seen this team in the recent seasons, and despite a competitive game back in 2021, the Huskies ultimately held off the Hawks by 9 points. Hurley has a history of scheduling games with HBCUs to promote competition and collaboration. This game is a chance for UConn to continue supporting HBCU programs while working on strategy and cohesiveness. I wonder, I'm going to float this out there. UConn's Ricky Moore is an assistant coach at HBCU, North Carolina A&T. Maybe there can be something that's worked out in the future where they could get together for that type of game. Just throwing it out there. The next one I'm talking about is Texas A&M Commerce. I'm completely honest with you. I follow this on like a daily basis. I had no idea there was such a team called Texas A&M Commerce. And here's why. Because they're building brand new in Division I. It's their third season at the D1 level with a ranking of 360 in Ken Pom. Those are rough. The Lions, coached by Jarrett Von Rosenberg, have been steadily improving despite a tough initial transition to Division I. Seems like they're still kind of there, but they bring a veteran roster with juniors and seniors, including a familiar face from New England's prep scene. One of my old stomping grounds at Cheshire Academy. His name is Casey Aguakazi. UConn's matchup against Texas A&M Commerce is a solid opportunity to build defensive schemes against some experienced players. Maybe I'm going to talk about all of this when I'm done going through it. Lemoyne, a newcomer to Division I, another fresh face for the Huskies this year, is a Northeast Conference team just in its second year of Division I competition, led by Nate Champion. They've adapted quickly to the demands of the higher level, finished 9-7 in conference last season. That's very impressive. Although Lemoyne can compete in the NCAA tournament, a dumb rule. Ken Pom predicts them to finish fourth in their conference. This will be UConn's first game ever against the Dolphins. Cool name, too. Offering a unique chance to see how they fare against a program that's still getting comfortable at the D1 level. By the way, what I meant by dumb rule is if you transition to D1 and you are so good in D2 that you go to D1 or whatever the process is, that first year, I think it's the first 2 years, you can't compete in the NCAA tournament, even if you win your conference. That happened with Merrimack, I think, one year. It's the dumbest. The NCAA always makes these dumb rules that they think they're somehow creating like competition or like leveling off competition, when in reality, it's like, why wouldn't you reward a team that if they make that transition and they do it seamlessly, why couldn't they compete in the NCAA tournament? It's just the dumbest thing in the world. Anyway, New Hampshire, a long, old foe. The New Hampshire Wildcats bring a bit of nostalgia, and they're one of UConn's oldest opponents, dating back to, 1906. Under Coach Nathan Davis, New Hampshire finished last season with a respectable 16-15 record, although their conference performance lagged at 7-9. Ken Pom had them ranked at 319. New Hampshire is not expected to pose a major threat, but the matchup represents an opportunity for UConn to keep its momentum in a series that's dominated since 1983. Given the long history, it's another chance for UConn to flex on a classic Northeastern opponent. And then round back to the beginning, my old buddies at Sacred Heart. The season opener, a familiar face, although another 300 level Ken Pom. Probable massacre. UConn will kick off that bye game massacre series with Sacred Heart, making the eighth meeting between these Connecticut-based teams since 2000. The Pioneers are newly added to the MAC, so they are getting better. They're finding more resources, so I'm joking. Moving from the Northeast Conference alongside Merrimack, they're ranked at 337 in Ken Pom, coached by Anthony Latina. Sacred Heart has a young roster with 6 true freshmen. Sacred Heart has not fared well against UConn. It's in its home crowd, and I expect a dominant performance. But the game offers UConn a chance to really start strong in a live game that counts, not an exhibition game. Work on offensive sets, work on going at a pace that makes sense. I think that's the biggest thing for me with all these bye games is going at a pace that makes sense. If a team allows you to break and allows you to play fast without going out of control, do it. If you take what the defense gives you, that's the beauty of this offense and what he looks for in these teams, which is guys who can process information fast and do it without thinking. So do it because they practiced it a million times. So as the season approaches, each of these games is going to really kind of test, I think, Dan Hurley's patience more than anybody. And also, I think some of the guys are going to have to look at this as a opportunity to really show out and show Dan what it'll look like when they start playing big time competition. Because by the time that fifth game rolls around and they've already played all these bye games and we're getting to Maryland Eastern Shore, we're probably going to know what this rotation looks like heading into the Maui. And that last game is going to kind of be I would say a audition, if you will, for some of these guys to be like, hey, do you want to play when we go out to Hawaii? Like, do you want to play against the big time teams like Memphis, Iowa State, Colorado, Dayton, whoever, North Carolina, Auburn? Well, if you didn't play your best against Lemoyne, how do I trust you against those teams? So I think the message is going to be sent well before that game, but you're going to kind of know what these rotations look like. So when we come back, we're going to start doing this all through the year. First two segments are going to always be about our UConn Huskies. And the third segment is going to be about around college basketball and how it relates to UConn as the year goes on with storylines. We're going to follow all of the big storylines. And there's some big ones that I want to talk about. Some probably UConn fans will hate, but some I think they're going to love. Talk about it coming up after the break. Nothing beats the energy of watching live basketball. I remember the very first time I went to a UConn basketball game. It wasn't in stores. It wasn't in Gampel Pavilion. It wasn't in Hartford at XL Center. It was at Madison Square Garden, and it was Danielle Marshall in the quarterfinals of the Big East tournament when he scored 42 points against St. John's, Seton Hall. I was 12. So if I could probably look up who it was, but that's not the purpose of this ad. It's to tell you that if I had game time back then, if my dad did, he probably would have tried to find better seats because we were way up there. And with game time, you get that seat view. You can kind of figure out so you don't pay more than you should. It's got this all-in pricing deal that shows the total up front. You even get a view from your seat, like I just mentioned, before buying. Plus, you get that lowest price guarantee. They've got you covered with flexible customer service and event protection too. It's designed to make buying tickets a breeze. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Who? All right, you're back on Locked On UConn for the final segment of today. Want to tease something. We are going to have, barring any unforeseen scheduling, we will have Eric Ryba in tomorrow to do a 30-minute interview with us about all things that he considered coming to stores, all of the things that we're excited about having him on campus, and really looking forward to him for the 25-26 season. So look forward to that tomorrow. Look for that tomorrow morning, if you will. But the biggest storylines outside of UConn nabbing a top 25 recruiting class this year for the 24-25 season are starting with an unprecedented conference realignment. I started to think about this when I was doing some of the women's stuff, like, you know, Juju Watkins and Lauren Betts at UCLA. Now they're in the Big Ten. So like all of these teams, there's 20 teams switching conferences. The landscape is almost unrecognizable. So let's go through it. We're looking at teams like Arizona State, who just got destroyed by Duke in an exhibition. I know Duke fans are taking their victory lap with an exhibition, so that's always also very fun. Colorado and Utah joined the Big 12, while California, Stanford, SMU now sit in the ACC. As weird as that is, you add Oregon, UCLA, USC, and Washington migrating to the Big 10. Even on Saturday when I was watching college football, I was looking, going, Washington's playing Indiana. Does that mean Washington's in the Big 10? Yeah, there it is. They are. And traditional conferences they're not there. So this kind of movement breaks up old rivalries, throws in new scheduling challenges, and really raises questions about how these shifts impact how they impact the NCAA tournament. So whether this trend benefits the sport future is really kind of up in the air, up for debate, but it's safe to say it's a massive storyline kicking off the season, without a doubt. So take a look for that. If you're watching a game, you're like, why is Washington playing, Indiana in Bloomington? It's because that's a freaking conference game. It's wild. And then there's our old pals at Duke in Cooper Flag. Yes, I know that I've talked about how he's as undeserving of a preseason All-American as you could possibly be, but it doesn't mean that he's not a storyline. There's a difference. The difference is he shouldn't be rewarded for something that he hasn't earned, but he has earned the respect of a lot of players on Team USA and coaches and analysts who say that he is a absolutely generational talent. So we're seeing a player who's generating that attention probably for the first time since Zion Williamson. We saw how that ended in the Sweet 16. Actually, the Elite Eight, I believe, against Michigan State. I'm not sure either one of those games. I think they lost. I think they were about to lose in the Sweet 16 to Central Florida or UFC. Yeah, I think so. But either way, the point is that team didn't make the Final Four. And this kid's going to be probably the number one pick in the draft. I think barring anything unforeseen like an injury, God forbid. I think Flag's playmaking, athleticism, and time with that USA Select team have only added to the anticipation. And Duke fans are hoping he can bring this program its first national title since 2015. I wouldn't bet on it, and only because, not because I'm a Duke hater and I'm self-proclaimed, but because even though when you watch that exhibition the other night and you see how crisp this team looks right now, you're still relying on freshmen in a time where older teams have been able to dominate the landscape, one of which, even though we're a little younger, is the reigning two-time defending champion UConn Huskies. And yes, UConn's potential three-peat is an absolute must-watch because Coach Dan Hurley is deciding to figure out if he can become the next modern-day John Wooden and make the same history that hasn't been achieved since John Wooden's UCLA teams. Though they lost some top players, as you guys already know. If you watch this show, we've talked about it a zillion times. UConn deserves the opportunity to be considered one of the top teams, even though they're basically bringing back an entirely new starting five outside of maybe Alex. You look at that and you go, well, I think the storyline is basically like when they're going to lose, right? Well, that's also part of the fun of it. If you're not a UConn fan, that's a hate watch. You want to wait until someone knocks them off, and what if they don't? Because that's what last year was. People were waiting for that time. That's what that NCAA tournament was. It was, let's put as many big time. There was more tournament champions in UConn's bracket in the East to try to knock them off before they even got to the Final Four than any of the other brackets combined. So what that tells you is the powers that be really don't want to see this to happen, because I think what they want to see happen is parity. That having a villain and having a national champion like UConn is great until it gets to the point where it gets ridiculous, where they start to win. They've won back-to-back titles in dominant fashion. They haven't lucked their way through this. Winning by 14 points a game on average isn't luck. And also, or by minimum 14. I think there was 23 points last year. It was 20 points the year before. So I think there's something to be said about that. And I will be interested to see how Alex Caravan steps up, Aidan Mahaney, the rest of the group, Liam McNeely. I'm a big fan of Ahmad Noel. I think he's going to play big-time minutes. Jaden Ross, Jalen Stewart, how the defense reacts to no Klingon. That storyline will be fascinating to me as the year goes on. Then there's the resurgence of some blue blood programs, I think highlighted by Louisville. Louisville has had a tough few years, and I think with Pat Kelsey under the helm there, I think they're going to breathe some new life into this ACC team, the East ACC, conference that kind of feels like it's dead. I say that with all due respect. I have friends who coach in the ACC. One most notably Steve Forbes, who I've mentioned a few times. I love him. I think Pat Kelsey's a good dude. I think his shirt's a little too tight for him. But, hey, you're in the gym. You're trying to show off those guns. I totally understand where he's coming from. He's got that tough guys, tough little man syndrome. I get it. Listen, his teams are usually pretty tough. I'll tell you that. College of Charleston. Who was the other team he faced? He was a coach of. Was it Wingate? I forget. Doesn't matter. But the bottom line is the Duke can coach. And I think you can even throw a little Indiana in there. I think they did enough in the transfer portal where if they make it to the Sweet 16, it'd be the first time since 2016. So that's going to be an interesting one. And then lastly, but not least, Calipari coming to the SEC and not moving literally across the way in the SEC to Arkansas, and how that's going to be perceived February 1st in Lexington when Calipari returns in a different shade of blue is almost, I think it's going to be cinematic, like where it's kind of like, that's must-see TV, whether you're a UConn fan or not. I think it's going to be fantastic to watch him walk into Rupp Arena. The Wildcat fan base really kind of pushed him out. People will tell you otherwise. And now he's facing Kentucky as an opponent in conference, which is so wild. Mark Pope now with Kentucky has done a good job of bringing in some good transfers. So this showdown will be one of the most intense games of the season. So I am super excited about those storylines for the 24-25 college basketball season. And I'm just excited for this basketball season to start. This has been another episode of Locked On UConn. I'm your host, Mark Zanetto, asking you to stay locked in, stay connected, make sure those toughness meters are always rising. And as always, go Huskies.